The cargo ship Meridian's Grace drifted silently through the asteroid field, its hull scarred by decades of interstellar travel. Captain Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge watching the scanner display with growing unease. 3 days ago, they had received a distress beacon from the mining colony on Kepler 442c. The message was brief and terrifying. They came from the dark. Everyone is gone. Only the children remain. The crew of 12 had volunteered for this rescue mission, knowing full well the dangers. The Outer Rim territories were plagued by the Shadows, a species so alien and ruthless that even the Galactic Council refused to venture into their hunting grounds. These creatures were nightmares made real, standing 8 feet tall with obsidian skin that seemed to absorb light itself. Their elongated limbs ended in razor-sharp claws, and their faces were a horrible amalgamation of insect and predator, with compound eyes that glowed like dying stars. "Captain, we're receiving another signal," reported Lieutenant Chen from the communications station. His voice carried a tremor that he couldn't quite hide. It's coming from the colony's emergency shelter." Elena moved to his station, her boots echoing in the silence. The entire crew had gathered around, their faces pale in the blue glow of the monitors. The signal was weak but clear, a child's voice barely above a whisper. "Hello? Is anyone there? Please help us. The monsters are outside. They've been hunting us for days." The voice belonged to a little girl no more than 7 or 8 years old. Elena felt her heart clench as she heard the terror masked by forced bravery. "This is Captain Vasquez of the Meridian's Grace. We're coming to help you. How many of you are there?" "There are 15 of us hiding in the shelter. The grown-ups tried to fight them, but..." The transmission crackled with static. "They're so strong and fast. They killed everyone else. We've been hiding for 3 days now." Dr. Sarah Martinez, the ship's medical officer, stepped forward. "Sweetheart, are any of you hurt? Do you have food and water? Some of the older kids are hurt, but we're sharing our emergency rations. The monsters keep trying to break in, but the door is really thick. They scratch at it all night, making horrible sounds." Elena exchanged glances with her first officer, Commander Torres. They both knew the reputation of the Shadows. These creatures didn't just kill, they hunted for sport, often keeping their prey alive for days to savor the fear. The fact that the children had survived this long was nothing short of miraculous. "Listen carefully," Elena said into the microphone. "We'll be there in 6 hours. Keep that door locked no matter what happens. Don't open it for anyone except us. We'll use the code word butterfly when we arrive." "Okay," the little girl replied, her voice growing even smaller. "But Captain, I need to tell you something important. There's a man here with us. He's not from the colony. He appeared after the monsters came." The bridge fell silent. Elena felt ice forming in her veins. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" "Describe this man. He's tall and has scars on his face. He doesn't talk much, but he keeps us calm when the monsters come. He says he's been hunting them for a long time. The weird thing is, Captain, the monsters are afraid of him." Commander Torres leaned closer to the microphone. "What makes you think they're afraid?" "Because when he stands near the door, they stop scratching. They make these chittering sounds like they're scared. And yesterday, when one of them tried to break the ventilation grate, he just looked up at it and whispered something. The monster ran away." Elena's mind raced. Who could this mysterious man be? How had he gotten to the colony? And most importantly, what kind of person could frighten the most feared predators in the galaxy? "What's his name?" she asked. There was a pause, filled with the sound of whispered conversation. Then the little girl's voice returned, smaller than before. "He says his name is Marcus. Marcus Kane. He told me something else, Captain. He said that when you arrive, you should be very careful. The monsters have set a trap." The transmission cut to static. Elena stared at the dead microphone, her mind reeling. Marcus Kane was a name from legend, a ghost story told in the darkest corners of the galaxy. Some said he was a former Marine who had snapped after losing his family to the Shadows. Others claimed he was something else entirely, a hunter who had transcended human limitations in his quest for vengeance. Most people believed he was just a myth. "Captain," Chen said quietly, "should I try to re-establish contact?" "Keep trying," Elena ordered, "and plot the fastest course to Kepler 442c. If there's even a chance those children are alive, we're going to save them." As the Meridian's Grace altered course toward the distant colony, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were flying into something far more dangerous than a simple rescue mission. The name Marcus Kane echoed in her thoughts like a prayer or a curse. In the depths of space, something ancient and hungry stirred, sensing the approach of both prey and predator. The shadows had never encountered a human who fought back effectively. They were about to learn that humanity's greatest weapon wasn't technology or numbers. It was the infinite capacity for those who had lost everything to become something far more terrifying than any monster. The colony on Kepler 442c had once been a thriving mining operation, home to nearly 300 souls extracting rare earth minerals from the planet's crust. Now it was a graveyard. As the Meridian's grace descended through the thin atmosphere, the crew could see the devastation spread across the settlement like a cancer. Buildings were torn apart, their metal walls peeled back like flower petals. Vehicles lay overturned and gutted, their contents scattered across the dusty ground. But it was the complete absence of bodies that chilled Elena to the bone. The shadows always took their kills, dragging them back to their nest for reasons no one wanted to contemplate. Landing sequence initiated, reported Torres. I'm not detecting any immediate threats, but the scanner shows multiple heat signatures moving through the outer buildings. Elena studied the tactical display. The shadows were definitely still here, at least 20 of them spread throughout the colony. They seemed to be moving in coordinated patterns, almost like they were patrolling. They're organized, she murmured. That's new. The ship touched down in the central plaza, its landing thrusters sending up clouds of red dust. Through the viewport, the crew could see the emergency shelter, a reinforced bunker built into the hillside beyond the main settlement. It looked intact, but they couldn't tell if anyone was still alive inside. All right, listen up, Elena addressed her team. We go in fast and hard. Full combat gear, energy weapons set to maximum. The Shadow's skin can absorb conventional projectiles, but energy blast will punch right through them. Stay together, watch each other's backs, and remember, these things are faster and stronger than anything you've ever faced. The 12-person crew armed themselves with pulse rifles and plasma grenades. Dr. Martinez carried a medical kit that could treat everything from laser burns to severed limbs. Elena had ordered everyone to wear full environmental suits, not just for protection against the planet's thin atmosphere, but because the shadows were known to use chemical weapons secreted from glands in their claws. As they prepared to disembark, Chen's communication console crackled to life. The little girl's voice emerged from the static, barely audible and filled with terror. Captain, are you there? Something's happening. The monsters are acting strange. They're all gathering around the shelter, but they won't come close. They keep looking at Marcus and making these awful sounds. Elena grabbed the microphone. We're here, sweetheart. We're coming to get you right now. Stay calm and keep that door locked. Captain Marcus wants to talk to you. There was a shuffle of movement, and then a new voice came through the speakers. It was deep, gravelly, and carried the weight of unimaginable sorrow. Captain Vasquez, this is Marcus Kane. I need you to listen very carefully. The shadows have been using the children as bait. They know you're here, and they're prepared for your arrival. They've learned to set traps, to think tactically. This isn't just a hunting pack anymore, it's a war party. Elena felt her blood run cold. How do we proceed? You don't. Take your ship and leave. I'll handle the shadows and get the children out. Like hell we're leaving, Elena snapped. We came here to rescue those kids, and that's exactly what we're going to do. There was a long pause before Marcus spoke again. His voice was softer now, almost gentle. You have no idea what you're walking into, Captain. I've been hunting these creatures for 15 years. I know their patterns, their weaknesses, their fears. You and your crew will only get in the way. And what gives you the right to make that decision? Elena demanded. Because I'm already dead, Captain. I died the day they took my family. Everything since then has just been momentum. The transmission ended in static. Elena stared at the dead microphone, then looked at her crew. Every face showed the same mix of determination and terror. They all knew the stories about the shadows, but they were here for a reason. Each of them had volunteered for this mission knowing they might not return. Orders, Captain? Torres asked quietly. Elena checked her pulse rifle one final time. We stick to the plan. Fast extraction, minimal engagement. Get to that shelter, grab the kids, and get out. Whatever this Marcus Kane thinks he can do alone, he'll have better odds with backup. The airlock cycled open with a hydraulic hiss. The crew of the Meridian's Grace stepped onto the surface of Kepler 442c, their boots crunching on the rust-colored soil. The air was thin and cold, filled with an ozone smell that made their environmental suits work overtime to filter out toxins. Elena raised her hand, signaling for the team to advance. They moved in formation toward the shelter, weapons ready, eyes scanning the abandoned buildings for any sign of movement. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the soft hum of their life support systems and the distant howl of wind through the broken structures. They had covered barely 50 meters when Torres suddenly froze. "Contact," he whispered into his helmet microphone. 11 o'clock behind the processing plant. Elena looked where he was pointing and felt her heart skip a beat. A shadow emerged from behind a twisted piece of machinery, moving with liquid grace despite its massive size. Its compound eyes fixed on the rescue team, and for a moment nobody moved. Then the creature threw back its head and let out a sound that was part roar, part laughter. It was answered by similar calls from at least a dozen other locations around the colony. The hunt had begun. But as the shadows began to converge on their position, Elena noticed something strange. The creatures were moving slowly, almost leisurely, as if they had all the time in the world. They weren't charging in for a quick kill. They were herding the humans, driving them toward the shelter. That's when Elena realized the horrible truth. Marcus Kane had been right. This was a trap, and they had walked right into it. The shadows moved like living nightmares, their obsidian forms flowing between the ruined buildings with predatory grace. Elena's team found themselves being systematically herded toward the emergency shelter, cut off from retreat by the coordinated movements of at least 20 creatures. "They're not attacking," Torres observed, his voice tight with confusion. "They're just pushing us forward." Elena watched the nearest shadow pause beside an overturned mining vehicle, its compound eyes reflecting the pale sunlight like fractured mirrors. The creature's behavior was unsettling, too intelligent, too calculated. These weren't the mindless predators described in the military briefings. "Fall back to defensive positions," Elena ordered. "Something's wrong here." The team took cover behind chunks of concrete and twisted metal, but the shadows made no move to close the distance. Instead, they began a slow, deliberate advance that maintained perfect spacing. Elena could see more of them emerging from hiding spots throughout the colony, behind buildings and drainage ditches, even hanging from the skeletal remains of communication towers. Dr. Martinez's scanner beeped frantically. "Captain, I'm reading massive bioelectric activity. These things are communicating with each other through some kind of electromagnetic field." The revelation sent chills down Elena's spine. The shadows weren't just working together, they were operating as a hive mind, sharing information and coordinating their movements with military precision. A new sound cut through the air, the screech of metal being torn apart. Elena looked toward the emergency shelter and saw something that made her blood freeze. 3 shadows were systematically dismantling the heavy blast doors that protected the children, their claws slicing through reinforced steel like tissue paper. "They're breaching the shelter," Chen shouted. Elena made the hardest decision of her command career. "All units advance. We can't let them reach those kids." The rescue team broke cover and sprinted toward the shelter, pulse rifles blazing. The energy beam struck the shadows with devastating effect, burning through their light-absorbing skin and sending them reeling backward. But for everyone they hit, 2 more appeared to take its place. Elena dove behind a supply crate as a shadow's claws whistled through the air where her head had been a split second before. The creature's face was a horror of compound eyes and mandibles. But what terrified her most was the intelligence she saw there. This thing was studying her, learning from her movements. "Captain," Torres's voice crackled through her helmet communicator. "The blast doors are failing." Elena looked up to see the shelter's entrance finally give way. The massive doors crashed to the ground with a thunderous bang, exposing the dark interior beyond. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the shadows began to move toward the opening, their movements slow and deliberate, savoring the moment. That's when Elena heard it, a sound that made every shadow on the battlefield freeze in place. It was barely audible over the combat noise, but it cut through everything else like a blade through silk. A little girl's voice, clear and unafraid. "Marcus says it's time." The first shadow to reach the shelter entrance suddenly jerked backward as if struck by an invisible force. Dark fluid sprayed from its throat and it collapsed with a wet thud. The other creatures turned toward the shelter, their predatory confidence replaced by something Elena had never seen in them before: fear. A figure emerged from the darkness of the shelter, moving with fluid precision that made the shadows look clumsy by comparison. Marcus Kane was exactly what Elena had expected and nothing like she had imagined. He was tall and lean, his face marked by scars that spoke of countless battles. But it was his eyes that made her breath catch. They held the cold fire of someone who had stared into the abyss so long that it had stared back. In his hands, he carried weapons that defied easy description. They looked like modified energy rifles, but they hummed with power that made the air itself vibrate. Attached to his belt were devices that pulsed with bioluminescent light, trophies taken from fallen shadows. The creatures began to back away from him, their earlier coordination dissolving into panic. Marcus raised one of his weapons and spoke in a voice that carried across the battlefield despite being barely above a whisper. "You made a mistake coming here." The nearest shadow lunged at him with impossible speed, its claws extended to tear him apart. Marcus didn't dodge, he simply stepped forward and drove his weapon into the creature's chest. There was a sound like reality tearing, and the shadow simply ceased to exist. Its matter dispersed into quantum particles that sparkled briefly in the air before vanishing. The other shadows began to emit high-pitched, chittering sounds, communicating frantically through their electromagnetic link. Elena realized with shock that they were trying to coordinate a retreat. But Marcus wasn't finished. He moved through their ranks like death incarnate, each step calculated, each strike precise. His weapons didn't just kill the shadows, they unmade them, reducing the galaxy's most feared predators to scattered atoms. Elena watched in fascination and horror as the man single-handedly dismantled a force that had terrorized the outer rim for decades. But it wasn't his weapons or his skill that truly frightened the shadows. It was the complete absence of fear in his movements. He fought like someone who had already accepted death, which made him far more dangerous than any monster. The surviving shadows began to flee, their earlier confidence shattered. They scattered in all directions, desperate to escape the human who had somehow become more terrifying than they were. Marcus watched them go without pursuit, his weapons powering down. Then he turned toward Elena and her team, and for the first time she saw him smile. It was a sad, tired expression that spoke of losses too great to quantify. "Captain Vasquez," he said, his voice carrying easily across the distance. "Thank you for coming. The children are safe." As if summoned by his words, a small group emerged from the shelter, 15 young faces, dirty and frightened but alive. Among them was the little girl whose voice had guided them here, her hand firmly grasped in Marcus's scarred fingers. She looked up at Elena with eyes far too old for her age and whispered, "He kept his promise." The monsters aren't laughing anymore. The emergency shelter had become a makeshift refuge, its walls lined with sleeping bags and emergency supplies. Elena watched as Dr. Martinez examined the children, her medical scanner revealing the physical toll of their 3-day ordeal. Most showed signs of severe stress and dehydration, but miraculously, none had suffered serious injuries. Marcus Kane sat apart from the group, methodically cleaning his weapons with movements that spoke of long practice. Elena had tried several times to approach him, but each attempt had been met with polite deflection. The man was clearly more comfortable with silence than conversation. The little girl who had first contacted them, Elena had learned her name was Sophie, seemed to be the only one Marcus would speak to freely. She sat beside him now, carefully organizing the medical supplies Dr. Martinez had distributed. "Sophie," Elena said gently, kneeling beside the child, "can you tell me what happened here? How did Marcus find you?" Sophie looked up with those unnaturally mature eyes. "The monsters came in the night. They were different from the stories the grown-ups told us, smarter. They cut the power first, then the communications. By the time the alarms went off, they were already inside the main compound." Elena felt her throat tighten. "What about your parents?" "Mom and Dad were in the mining complex when it started. The monsters sealed all the exits and—" Sophie's voice trailed off, but she didn't cry. Elena suspected the child had already shed all the tears she had. "The older kids got us to the shelter," Sophie continued, "but the monsters found us anyway. They didn't try to break in right away. They just waited, like they were enjoying our fear." Marcus looked up from his weapons, his scarred face impassive. "The shadows have evolved beyond simple predation. They've learned to savor psychological terror as much as physical destruction." "Is that how you found them?" Elena asked. "Through their hunting patterns?" Marcus was quiet for so long that Elena thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old grief. I didn't find them, Captain. They found me. 15 years ago on a colony world called Haven's Rest, Elena knew that name. Haven's Rest had been one of the first shadow attacks, back when the Galactic Council still believed they could negotiate with the creatures. The entire population of 8,000 had vanished overnight. I was off-world when it happened, Marcus continued, his hands never stopping their mechanical cleaning motions. Military patrol duty. When I came home, there was nothing left but empty buildings and the smell of ozone. My wife, my daughter, they were gone. Sophie reached over and touched his arm gently. Elena watched something pass between them, a recognition of shared loss that transcended age. The military wrote it off as a total loss, Marcus said. Told me to move on, start over. But I couldn't let it go. I spent 2 years tracking the pack that had taken my family, learning their behavior, studying their biology. When I finally found them, he trailed off, but Elena could see the memory playing behind his eyes. What happened? I killed them all. Every last one. But it wasn't enough. There were always more packs, more colonies under threat. So I kept hunting. Elena studied his weapons more closely. They were clearly custom-built, incorporating technology she didn't recognize. Where did you get those? Marcus held up one of the devices, its surface covered in intricate circuitry that seemed to pulse with its own light. Shadow biology is fascinating when you really study it. Their skin doesn't just absorb light. It absorbs all forms of electromagnetic radiation, but that same adaptation makes them vulnerable to quantum disruption fields. Dr. Martinez looked up from her medical scanner. You're using their own biology against them? Every creature has weaknesses, Doctor. Even nightmares. Marcus's smile was cold and predatory. The shadows fear very few things in this galaxy, but they've learned to fear humans who have nothing left to lose. Commander Torres, who had been monitoring the perimeter, suddenly straightened. Captain, we have a problem. Long-range sensors are picking up massive movement in the outer system. At least 50 shadow vessels approaching at high speed. Elena felt her stomach drop. How long until they arrive? 6 hours, maybe less. Marcus stood slowly, his weapons automatically securing themselves to his harness. They're coming for me. The pack I destroyed here was part of a larger hive. When they stopped reporting, the others would have investigated. Then we leave now, Elena said. All of us. The Meridian's grace can outrun their ships. Marcus shook his head. Not with 15 children on board. Shadow vessels are fast and maneuverable. They'll catch you before you reach the system's edge. So what do you suggest? Marcus walked to the shelter's entrance and stared out at the abandoned colony. I stay here. Give them what they came for. Sophie jumped to her feet, her small hands clenched into fists. No, you promised you wouldn't leave us. Marcus knelt beside the little girl, his expression softening for the first time since Elena had met him. I promised I'd keep you safe, Sophie. This is how I do that. There has to be another way, Elena protested. We don't abandon our own. Marcus looked at her with something that might have been surprise. I'm not one of yours, Captain. I stopped being part of humanity a long time ago. That's where you're wrong, Elena said firmly. What you did here today, saving these children, standing between them and the monsters, that's the most human thing I've ever witnessed. For a moment, Marcus's carefully maintained composure cracked, and Elena saw the man he had been before tragedy transformed him into something else. Then the mask slipped back into place. The shadows won't stop coming, he said quietly. As long as I'm alive, they'll hunt me, and anyone who gets in their way will die. Sophie stepped forward and took his hand. Then we'll fight them together. That's what families do. Elena watched as the broken man stared down at the brave little girl, and she realized that something fundamental had shifted in the equation. Marcus Kane had spent 15 years becoming a weapon of vengeance, but Sophie was offering him something he thought he'd lost forever. A reason to be human again. The abandoned mining complex had been transformed into a fortress. Elena's crew worked alongside Marcus, using mining equipment and structural materials to create defensive positions throughout the settlement. What had once been a peaceful colony was now preparing for the largest shadow assault in recorded history. Marcus moved through the preparations with mechanical efficiency, placing his custom weapons at strategic points and rigging explosive charges in the outer buildings. Elena watched him work, noting how his every action was calculated for maximum effectiveness. This wasn't his first time preparing for a siege. The shadows will try to isolate us from each other. Marcus explained as he showed Torres how to configure the quantum disruption mines. They've learned that humans fight better when they can see their allies. Break our line of sight and they can pick us off one by one. How do you know so much about their tactics? Torres asked. Marcus paused in his work, his scarred hands tightening on the device he was calibrating. Because I've been on both sides of this fight. Hunter and hunted. The shadows taught me how to think like them, and I've spent 15 years teaching them to fear that knowledge turned against them. Dr. Martinez was busy setting up a medical station in the shelter's main chamber, while Chen worked to boost their communication array. The children helped where they could, their young faces showing a determination that broke Elena's heart. They had already lost everything once, they wouldn't let it happen again. Sophie stayed close to Marcus, absorbing his every word and movement like a student learning from a master. Elena found their relationship both touching and disturbing. The little girl was learning to be a warrior from someone who had forgotten how to be anything else. Marcus, Elena said during a brief pause in the preparations, tell me honestly, what are our chances? Marcus looked up from the quantum disruptor he was modifying, his eyes reflecting the pale light of the planet's distant sun. Against 50 shadow vessels? With a crew of 12 and 15 children? He was quiet for a moment. If we were trying to win, I'd say 0. But we're not trying to win, Captain. We're trying to survive long enough for the children to escape. And you? What happens to you when this is over? Marcus's smile was sad and tired. I've been dead for 15 years, Captain. I just haven't stopped moving yet. Before Elena could respond, Chen's voice crackled through their communicators. Contact. Multiple vessels dropping out of hyperspace. They're here. Through the shelter's reinforced windows, they could see the shadow fleet materializing in the pale sky above. The ships were unlike anything in human design, organic-looking vessels that seemed to pulse with their own malevolent life. They moved through the atmosphere like predators descending on wounded prey. Remember the plan, Marcus said, his voice calm despite the approaching doom. Let them land. Let them come to us. The moment they step foot in the colony, this becomes our battlefield, not theirs. The first shadow transports touched down in the outer perimeter, disgorging their alien cargo with practiced efficiency. Elena counted at least 200 creatures emerging from the ships, far more than they had ever faced before. These weren't just hunters, this was an army. But something was different about these shadows. They moved with purpose rather than predatory patience, and their formation was militaristic rather than pack-based. At their center walked something that made Elena's blood freeze, a shadow unlike any she had ever seen. This one was larger than the others, its obsidian skin marked with bioluminescent patterns that pulsed with hypnotic rhythm. Where the other shadows had compound eyes, this one possessed a single, massive optical organ that seemed to reflect not light but the very essence of darkness itself. Shadow Prime, Marcus whispered, and for the first time since Elena had met him, she heard genuine fear in his voice. What is that thing? Their leader. Their general. I've heard rumors, but I never thought. Marcus's hands moved to his weapons, checking their charge levels with renewed urgency. Captain, the situation just changed. That creature out there isn't just intelligent, it's ancient. It's been alive for centuries, learning, adapting, growing stronger. The Shadow Prime raised one massive arm and the entire alien force came to a halt. Even from this distance, Elena could feel its attention pressing against her mind like a physical weight. When it spoke, its voice somehow reached them without the aid of technology, bypassing their ears and speaking directly to their consciousness. Marcus Kane. The words carried the weight of eons and the promise of suffering beyond imagination. You have cost us much, little hunter. But your game ends here. Marcus stepped to the entrance of the shelter, placing himself between the alien force and the children behind him. I've been waiting for you, he called out, his voice carrying clearly across the distance. Tired of sending your children to die? The Shadow Prime's laugh was a sound like reality breaking. Children? You think the creatures you have slaughtered were our young? No, Marcus Kane, they were our weakest, our failures. You have done us a service by culling them. Elena felt the blood drain from her face as the implications hit her. Everything they thought they knew about the shadow threat was wrong. The creatures that had terrorized the galaxy for decades weren't even their main force. But you have also taken something that belongs to us. The Shadow Prime continued. The small ones you protect carry genetic material we require. Return them, and your death will be swift. Sophie stepped up beside Marcus, her small hand slipping into his scarred fingers. When she spoke, her voice carried none of the fear Elena expected. Instead, it held the quiet confidence of someone who had faced monsters before and lived to tell about it. "We're not going anywhere with you," she said clearly. "Marcus taught us that monsters are only scary until someone stands up to them." The Shadow Prime's massive eye fixed on the little girl, and Elena saw something flicker across its alien features. Uncertainty? Confusion? "Impossible," it hissed. "The young ones should be paralyzed with terror. Our presence alone should render them catatonic." Marcus stepped forward, shielding Sophie with his body. "That's your first mistake. These aren't just any children. They're human children, and humans don't break as easily as you think." Elena watched as the other children emerged from the shelter to stand beside Sophie and Marcus. Their faces showed fear, yes, but also determination. They had survived 3 days of psychological warfare from creatures designed to inspire absolute terror. They weren't going to surrender now. The Shadow Prime studied this unexpected display of defiance, its ancient mind clearly struggling to process what it was seeing. When it spoke again, its voice carried a note of genuine curiosity. "Fascinating. You have taught them to resist our influence. Very well, Marcus Kane. Let us see how long their courage lasts when we begin to take them apart piece by piece." The Shadow Army began to advance, their movements coordinated and purposeful, but as they drew closer to the colony's defensive perimeter, Marcus smiled, a cold, predatory expression that made Elena's spine tingle. "That's your second mistake," he said softly. "You think this is still your hunt? But you're on my ground now, facing my family, and I've had 15 years to prepare for this moment." The battle erupted with a violence that shook the very foundations of the colony. Marcus's carefully placed quantum mines detonated as the first wave of shadows crossed the perimeter, sending brilliant flashes of disrupted matter cascading through their ranks. The creatures that survived the initial barrage found themselves facing a defensive network that seemed to anticipate their every move. Elena's crew fought with desperate precision, their pulse rifles creating a crossfire pattern that channeled the shadows into predetermined kill zones. But for every creature they destroyed, 2 more seemed to take its place. The alien army flowed through the colony like a tide of living darkness, probing for weaknesses in their defenses. Marcus moved through the chaos like a force of nature, his exotic weapons carving through shadow ranks with surgical efficiency. Elena watched him fight and finally understood why these creatures had learned to fear him. He didn't just kill them. He anticipated their movements, exploited their biological weaknesses, and turned their own predatory instincts against them. "Torres, fall back to position 3. Elena shouted into her communicator as a group of shadows attempted to flank their position. "Chen, activate the charges in Sector 7. The explosion that followed sent debris raining down on the battlefield, but the Shadow Prime remained untouched at the center of its forces, studying the human resistance with growing interest. "Remarkable," its voice echoed in their minds. "You fight as a coordinated unit despite being outnumbered 10 to 1. Most species break within the first few minutes of contact." Sophie and the other children had taken shelter in the reinforced bunker, but Elena could see them through the transparent aluminum windows, their faces pressed against the barrier as they watched the battle unfold. They weren't cowering in terror. They were learning, studying the tactics that Marcus and Elena's crew employed against their tormentors. "Dr. Martinez, how are we on ammunition?" Elena called out as she fired another burst at a shadow attempting to scale the defensive wall. "Running low on energy cells," Martinez replied from her position near the medical station. "Maybe 10 minutes of sustained fire left." Marcus appeared beside Elena's position, his armor scored by shadow claws but his movements still fluid and controlled. "The Prime is testing us," he said, reloading one of his quantum disruptors. "It's not committing its full force because it wants to understand how we're fighting back. Can we use that against it?" "Maybe, but we need to." Marcus suddenly spun and fired in one smooth motion, his beam slicing through a shadow that had been creeping up behind them. "We need to make it angry, force it to make mistakes." Elena ducked as another shadow leaped over their barricade, its claws whistling through the air where her head had been. Torres's pulse rifle took the creature's center mass, dispersing its matter into quantum particles. "How do we anger something that old and intelligent?" Marcus's smile was sharp as a blade. "We do what humans do best, Captain. We surprise it. He activated his communicator and spoke to the children in the bunker. "Sophie, remember what I taught you about the quantum resonance frequency?" The little girl's voice came back clear and determined. "The one that makes their skin burn?" "That's right. I need you and the others to help me now. Are you ready?" Elena watched in amazement as the 15 children moved to different positions within the bunker, each one placing their hands on specific panels that Marcus had apparently prepared earlier. She realized this had been part of his plan all along. The children weren't just being protected, they were part of the defense. "What are they doing?" she asked. "The Shadow's greatest strength is their networked intelligence," Marcus explained as he made final adjustments to a device Elena hadn't noticed before. "But that same network can be turned into a weapon. The children's bioelectric fields, properly amplified and directed, can create a feedback loop in the Shadow consciousness. The Shadow Prime must have sensed something changing because its massive form suddenly stiffened." "What are you doing, Marcus Kane?" "Teaching you the same lesson I learned 15 years ago," Marcus replied, his hand hovering over the activation switch. Sometimes the smallest voices carry the greatest power. Sophie's clear voice cut through the chaos of battle as she and the other children began to speak in unison. They weren't reciting words. They were generating specific sound frequencies that Marcus's equipment amplified and broadcast directly into the electromagnetic spectrum the Shadows used for communication. The effect was immediate and devastating. Every shadow on the battlefield suddenly froze, their compound eyes flickering as their networked consciousness was flooded with an overload of contradictory signals. Several of the smaller creatures actually collapsed, their nervous systems unable to process the interference. The Shadow Prime let out a roar that seemed to tear the very air around it. "Impossible. The young ones should not be able to." "You made the same mistake everyone makes," Marcus said, stepping forward with his most powerful weapon charged and ready. "You underestimated human children. You thought they were just prey, but they're survivors. They adapt. They learn, and most importantly, they remember." Elena watched as Sophie pressed her small hand against the window of the bunker, her eyes meeting the massive optical organ of the Shadow Prime across the battlefield. When she spoke, her voice was amplified through Marcus's equipment, reaching every shadow on the planet. "We remember our parents. We remember our friends. We remember everyone you took from us, and we're not afraid of you anymore." The psychological impact was staggering. The Shadows, creatures that had dominated through fear and intimidation for centuries, found themselves facing prey that refused to be terrorized. The children's combined voices created a resonance that disrupted their ability to coordinate, to think collectively, to function as the perfect predators they believed themselves to be. Marcus seized the moment, launching himself directly at the Shadow Prime with weapons blazing. The ancient creature tried to defend itself, but its connection to its forces was compromised, its tactical advantage negated by the interference the children were generating. Elena's crew pressed their attack, their remaining ammunition proving devastatingly effective against shadows, whose defensive coordination had been shattered. But it was the sight of the children, 15 young humans standing together unafraid, using their very humanity as a weapon, that truly broke the alien force. The Shadow Prime's eye fixed on Sophie one final time, and Elena saw something she never expected to see in such a creature: recognition, respect, and perhaps, for the first time in its ancient existence, genuine fear. "This is not possible," it whispered, its voice no longer carrying the absolute confidence of a supreme predator. "How do the small ones resist our influence?" Sophie smiled, and her answer carried the weight of every human who had ever stood against impossible odds. "Because someone taught us that monsters are only scary if you let them be. And Marcus taught us to never let them be." The Shadow Prime staggered backward, its form beginning to shimmer as its forces prepared for retreat. But Marcus wasn't finished. His final shot struck the ancient creature center mass, and for the first time in centuries, a Shadow Prime fell. As its massive form dispersed into quantum particles, the remaining shadows let out a collective wail that spoke of genuine loss. Their invincible leader, their ancient guide, had been destroyed by creatures they considered barely sentient. The retreat was swift and absolute. Within minutes, the surviving shadows had fled to their ships and vanished into the void, leaving behind only the echoes of their defeat and the proof that even the galaxy's most feared predators could be taught to fear. Elena looked around the battlefield, hardly believing they had survived. But it wasn't their weapons or tactics that had won the day. It was the unbreakable spirit of humanity, embodied in the voices of children who refused to surrender to the darkness. 3 months later, Elena stood on the observation deck of the Galactic Council station, watching news feeds from across the Outer Rim territories. The reports were unanimous and unprecedented. Shadow attacks had ceased entirely. The creatures that had terrorized the galaxy for decades had simply vanished, retreating to whatever dark corners of space they called home. The Battle of Kepler 442c, as historians were already calling it, had fundamentally changed humanity's standing in the galactic community. Species that had once viewed humans as primitive newcomers now spoke of them with a mixture of respect and cautious fear. The story of 15 children who had faced down an army of nightmares had spread throughout the galaxy like wildfire. Captain Vasquez to the briefing room, came the announcement over the station's communication system. Elena made her way through corridors filled with representatives from dozens of worlds, all eager to understand how humanity had achieved what their most advanced civilizations had deemed impossible. The briefing room was packed with officials, military leaders, and xenobiologists from across the Galactic Council. At the center of the gathering sat Sophie and the other children from Kepler 442c, no longer the terrified refugees Elena had first encountered. They had been transformed by their experience, carrying themselves with a quiet confidence that reminded Elena of their protector. Marcus Kane sat beside Sophie, looking uncomfortable with the attention but determined to see this through. The man who had spent 15 years as a solitary hunter was still adjusting to being part of something larger than his quest for vengeance. Council Administrator Vexhai, a tall crystalline being from the Andorian systems, stepped forward to address the assembly. The implications of what occurred on Kepler 442c extend far beyond a single victory, the alien said, its translated voice carrying harmonic undertones of respect. For the first time in recorded galactic history, the shadows have demonstrated fear of another species. Dr. Martinez, who had spent the past months studying the recorded data from the battle, stood to present her findings. The children's bioelectric fields, when properly amplified, created a resonance cascade that disrupted the Shadow's collective consciousness. But the technical aspects aren't what's truly significant here. She gestured to a holographic display showing brain scans of the children taken before and after the battle. What we're seeing is an evolutionary adaptation. These children have developed neural pathways that allow them to resist psychic intimidation. It's as if humanity is developing immunity to fear itself. Murmurs rippled through the assembly. The idea that an entire species could evolve beyond terror was revolutionary, challenging fundamental assumptions about predator-prey relationships throughout the galaxy. Sophie raised her small hand, and the room fell silent. When she spoke, her voice carried the same clear determination that had helped break a centuries-old enemy. It's not that we're not afraid. We still get scared. But Marcus taught us that being afraid doesn't mean you have to give up. Marcus looked down at the little girl who had become his anchor to humanity, his scarred face softening with something that might have been pride. The Shadow's greatest weapon was never their claws or their speed. It was their ability to make their victims believe they were helpless. But humans have a talent for refusing to accept helplessness. Elena thought about those words as she watched the interplay between the battle-hardened veteran and the children he had saved. In protecting them, Marcus had rediscovered his own humanity. In learning from him, the children had found strength they never knew they possessed. Council Administrator Vexhai turned to Marcus with a gesture of formal respect. The Galactic Council wishes to offer you a position as head of our new counter-predator division. Your knowledge and experience could help protect countless worlds from similar threats. Marcus was quiet for a long moment, his eyes distant as he considered the offer. Then Sophie tugged on his sleeve and whispered something Elena couldn't hear. Whatever the little girl said made Marcus smile, the first genuine expression of happiness Elena had ever seen from him. I appreciate the offer, Marcus said finally. But I've got a new job now. These kids have families to find, new homes to build, and a future to grow into. They're going to need someone to watch over them while they do it. The children beamed at his words, and Elena felt her heart swell with an emotion she couldn't quite name. Marcus Kane, the man who had become a weapon of vengeance, had chosen to become something far more powerful, a guardian, a teacher, a father figure to children who had lost everything. Commander Torres leaned over to Elena and spoke quietly. Think the shadows will come back? Elena watched as Sophie stood up and hugged Marcus, her small arms wrapping around the waist of the man who had taught her that monsters could be defeated. Maybe, she said, but if they do, they'll find that humanity has learned a few things about being scary. As the assembly began to disperse, Elena caught one final exchange between Sophie and Marcus. The little girl looked up at her protector with eyes that held wisdom beyond her years. Marcus, she said, do you think the monsters will ever stop being afraid of us? Marcus knelt down to meet her gaze, his expression serious but kind. That depends, Sophie. Do you think we'll ever stop standing up to them? Sophie's smile was bright and fearless. Never. Then no, Marcus replied, ruffling her hair gently. They'll never stop being afraid. Because the one thing monsters can't understand is courage that refuses to die. Elena watched them walk away. Together, the broken soldier who had found redemption and the brave child who had shown him the way, and she knew that the galaxy had fundamentally changed. Humanity had proven that even the darkest nightmares could be faced down by those willing to stand together and refuse to surrender to fear. In the depths of space, in hidden layers scattered across the rim territories, the shadows that had survived the Battle of Kepler 442c shared a new understanding through their collective consciousness. They had encountered something unprecedented in their eons of existence, prey that had become predator, not through superior strength or technology, but through the simple, terrifying refusal to be victims. The monsters had indeed learned to fear the whisper of a little girl saying, "He's coming for me." But more than that, they had learned to fear what came after those words, the sound of humans refusing to be afraid. And in that refusal, humanity had found its greatest weapon against the darkness between the stars.